just before midnight. A mansion outside Portsmouth, England, June 1944. Rain runs sideways across the tall windows and the wind shakes the glass in its frames. At a small desk under a single lamp, a man in a plain uniform with 4 stars on each shoulder bends over a scrap of paper and begins to write. The most powerful commander on earth is composing the hardest words of his life. Our landings have failed. I have withdrawn the troops. He is writing it now, hours before the battle has even begun. By morning, more than 150,000 men will climb into landing craft and aircraft and throw themselves at the coast of occupied France in the largest invasion the world has ever attempted. And the man at the desk is preparing the words he will give the world if every one of them fails. He signs nothing. He folds the paper and slides it into his wallet, against the chance that he will need it. Strip away 80 years of knowing how it ended, and stand in that room with him. Nothing about the next morning was certain. Twice already in this war, great seaborne assaults had ended in slaughter at the water's edge. If this one failed, there would not be another chance for a year, perhaps longer. Occupied Europe would stay occupied, and every one of the 150,000 men in the first wave was someone's son. Eisenhower knew all of it, and he knew the choice and the cost were his and no one else's. If lesser-known history told with respect is what you came for, subscribe, because almost no one knows this note exists. The man at the desk is General Dwight Eisenhower, and the decision behind that piece of paper had come down on his shoulders alone, against a storm, against his own commanders, and against a clock he could not stop. To understand the note, you have to go back 4 days to the worst weather the English Channel had seen in 50 years. By the spring of 1944, Eisenhower carried a burden no American soldier had carried before. He was the supreme Allied commander, the one man placed above the British and the Americans, the armies and the navies and the air forces, and on his word alone rested the invasion of Europe. Years of planning and 2 million men all pointed at a single stretch of Normandy coastline. But the whole machine depended on something no general could command: the weather. The landings needed calm seas for the boats, a low tide to expose the German beach obstacles, and a moon for the paratroopers. Those conditions aligned on only a handful of days in early June. Miss them, and the tides would be wrong for weeks. He set the date for June 5, and then the sky turned against him. A storm rolled in off the Atlantic, the worst the Channel had seen in half a century, with gale winds, low cloud, and heavy seas. At his forward headquarters, a mansion called Southwick House near Portsmouth, Eisenhower gathered his commanders in an oak-paneled library while the rain hammered the tall windows. Into that room came his chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, a quiet Scot whose forecast now held the invasion in their hands. His reading for June 5 was grim. Surf too high, cloud too low. To go would be to drown men in the sea and scatter the planes across the dark. Eisenhower made the call to postpone. Across southern England, the order rippled out to a coiled army. Ships that had already sailed were turned back in the heaving dark. Soldiers crammed below decks, seasick and waiting. Every hour of delay carried its own danger. Tens of thousands of men now knew roughly where and when the blow was coming, and a secret shared by that many cannot hold for long. If he waited past this window, the next chance was weeks away, by which time the enemy might piece it all together. The pressure on the one man who had to choose was almost beyond imagining. All across the south of England, the army waited inside the storm, camps sealed behind barbed wire so no man could carry the secret out. Roads jammed nose to tail with tanks and trucks and guns, harbours crammed with landing craft straining at their lines in the wind. More than 150 thousand assault troops, and behind them millions of tons of fuel and shells and rations, all of it wound tight and pointed at a coast across a furious sea. All of it waiting on a word from one man in a mansion outside Portsmouth. The longer it waited, the harder it strained. Eisenhower could feel the whole thing trembling under his hand. Then came a second blow, this one from his own side. His senior air commander, Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, brought him a warning in writing. The American paratroopers, meant to drop behind the beaches in the dark, would be slaughtered. He predicted as many as 70% of the gliders lost, and more than half the men killed or wounded before they ever reached the fight. And he urged Eisenhower to cancel the airborne plan entirely. But without the paratroopers holding the roads behind the beaches, the seaborne landings could fail as well. Eisenhower now faced a choice between two kinds of catastrophe, and either one would be his to answer for. There was no one above him to share it. A president could ask a general could ask a colonel. Eisenhower had no one. He walked the grounds alone. He smoked one cigarette after another, and he weighed lives against lives in his head. He later said the loneliness of command in those hours was something he could never fully describe to a person who had not felt it. And somewhere in that strain, he began to think about what he would have to say if the worst came true, and who would have to say it. And what turned it was a break in the sky. Late on June 4, Stagg returned to the library with something new, A narrow window was opening. The storm would ease for roughly 36 hours beginning the evening of the 5th. Not calm, not safe, but possibly enough. It was the thinnest of openings, built from readings taken by ships and lonely weather stations far out in the Atlantic, and if the forecast was wrong, the greatest army ever assembled would be wrecked on a hostile shore. Eisenhower stood and paced the room, hands behind his back, chin on his chest, while his commanders argued around him. He went around the room and asked each man in turn. His naval commander worried about the seas. His air chiefs were split, one calling it chancy, the airborne warning to his ground commander, General Montgomery, and asked if he saw any reason not to go. Montgomery looked him in the eye and said 4 words, "I would say go." The decision came back, as it always did, to the one man in the room who could not pass it to anyone else. Outside, the wind still tore at the house. Near midnight he made a preliminary decision. "I am quite positive," he said, "that the order must be given. But even then it was not truly final. The fleets could still be turned around if the dawn looked hopeless." So the commanders broke for a few hours, and Eisenhower lay down in his trailer while the storm still battered the coast, knowing that in the morning he would have to say the word that could not be unsaid. He did not really sleep. He lay in the dark and listened to the wind, and turned the impossible thing over and over in his mind. At 4:15 on the morning of June 5, in the rain and the dark, the commanders gathered one last time. Stagg confirmed it. The break would hold, just long enough. Now there was nothing left but the decision, and only one man could make it. Eisenhower sat quiet for a long moment, the room watching him. Then he looked up and said the words that launched the liberation of Europe. There was no cheer. The officers simply rose and hurried out into the storm to set 150,000 men in motion, and Eisenhower was left, as always, alone with what he had just done. Across the channel, the enemy was looking at the same storm and reading it the opposite way. The German commanders were certain no one would be mad enough to invade in such weather, and their own forecasters saw only foul seas. Senior officers stood their units down and left their posts to rest. The field marshal in charge of the coastal defenses had driven home to Germany to spend his wife's birthday with her, sure that nothing could happen. The very storm that tormented Eisenhower had become his greatest ally because it convinced the men on the far shore that they were safe. The Allies were coming through a door the enemy believed was bolted shut. Once the order was given, Eisenhower's power over the battle ended. He had done everything a commander could do. The plans were made, the men were moving, and from here the outcome belonged to soldiers he would never meet. In the dark, over France, and on the open water, a lesser man might have retreated to wait for reports. Instead, as the light failed on the evening of June 5, Eisenhower had himself driven to an airfield where the American paratroopers were loading for the very drop his own air chief had said would kill most of them. What he found there was a field full of young men he was almost certainly sending to their deaths. They were paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, their faces smeared black with cocoa and burnt cork, their heads shaved into ridges, weighed down with weapons and chutes and grenades until they could barely walk. They were loud, and they were laughing the way men laugh when they are terrified. Eisenhower walked in among them without ceremony, hands in his pockets, and spoke to them like a neighbor over a fence. He asked their names. He asked where they were from. "Texas, sir," one called back. Another shouted a town in the Midwest. He stopped in front of a young lieutenant from Michigan, a man who had turned 22 the day before, and instead of a speech, they talked about fishing back home. Photographer, the supreme commander with his hands in his pockets, looking up into the painted face of a boy dressed for war. He told them the thing he needed them to carry with them. Full victory, nothing less. He had already read the warning that said most of these men would not come back, and he stood there and looked them in the eye anyway. He stayed as the engines coughed and caught and the long lines of transport planes began to roll. One after another they lifted heavy off the runway and climbed into the failing light, packed with the boys he had just been joking with about trout streams. The drone of the engines filled the whole sky. Eisenhower stood at the edge of the field with his hands in his pockets and watched them turn out over the dark water toward France, toward the drop zones his own air chief had marked for death. He did not leave until the last of them had faded and the sky was empty. An aide who was with him said that as the last aircraft climbed away, Eisenhower's eyes filled with tears. He had just sent thousands of young men into the dark on the strength of a forecast, over the written objection of a commander who swore most of them would die. He is remembered saying quietly that it is very hard to look a soldier in the eye when you fear you are the one sending him to his death. Then he got back into the car. There was nothing left to do now but wait and prepare for the worst. And so we come back to the desk and the lamp and the rain. Somewhere in those waiting hours, Eisenhower took out a single sheet of paper and wrote the message he prayed he would never send. He did not blame the weather. He did not blame his commanders or the men or the enemy. He wrote that the troops, the air, and the navy had done all that bravery and devotion to duty could do, and then he wrote one line that tells you everything about him. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. He was so exhausted that he dated it wrong, writing July 5 instead of June. Then he folded it away and waited for the dawn. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the people of the Normandy coast woke to a sight no one had ever seen. The grey sea to the horizon was filled with ships, nearly 7,000 of them, more than had ever been gathered in one place in human history. Out of the landing craft came the first waves of men onto 5 beaches, into machine gun fire and mortar and wire, and on the one the Americans called Omaha, they fell in rows and kept coming anyway. Behind the lines, the scattered paratroopers, dropped miles from their targets in the dark, pulled themselves into small bands and seized the bridges and the crossroads. It was chaos, and it was costly, and it held. By the end of that first day, against everything that could have gone wrong, the Allies were ashore and staying ashore. The losses were heavy, thousands of men, but the catastrophe Eisenhower had braced for did not come. The airborne slaughter his air chief had predicted never materialized. Within days, that same commander wrote to Eisenhower to apologize for ever having doubted the plan. The foothold held, and then it grew, and from those 5 beaches, the liberation of Western Europe began its long road toward Berlin. The decision made in the dark by one exhausted man had been the right one. As for the note, Eisenhower forgot it. It stayed folded in his wallet through the fighting in Normandy, through the breakout, through the liberations. In mid-July, he was emptying his wallet and came across the small creased sheet of paper. He read it again, the words written for a defeat that had not come. His naval aide stopped him, recognized what it was, asked to keep it, recognized what it was, and asked to keep it. Eisenhower later said he wrote such notes before every operation. This is the only one that was ever saved. You can read his confident order of the day, the one handed to every soldier, in 100 history books. We will accept nothing less than full victory. But the other note, the private one, is the truer measure of the man. In his own memoir, Crusade in Europe, Eisenhower wrote almost nothing about that scrap of paper. He did not need it remembered. He had carried the entire weight of the invasion, and, win or lose, he had already decided that the blame would be his. And the credit would belong to the men who waded ashore. That single sheet of paper survives today, 4 sentences in a tired man's handwriting, with the wrong date in the corner. It is one of the most studied documents to come out of the entire war, not for what it announced, because it announced nothing, but for what it reveals about how a real leader carries a thing too heavy for any one person to carry. Go back to the library one more time. The rain on the glass, the single lamp, the most powerful soldier in the world bent over a scrap of paper, alone, writing down the words that would end his name if the morning went wrong. That is the picture worth keeping. Not the victory parades that came later. The man at the desk, in the dark before he knew. Everyone remembers the order that promised full victory. Almost no one remembers the note that promised to take the blame. But it was the second one, written in the dark with the wrong date, that showed what kind of man was giving the orders. If your father, grandfather, mother, anyone in your family served on D-Day or anywhere in the war, in any branch, leave their name and one thing about them in the comments. Not just a name. One thing they did or said or that you remember. They are the men he was writing about when he said the troops did all that bravery could do. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.